Hey guys, so what I'm going to look at here real quick is some of the main points that Wilford McClay, the author of our textbook, brings up in the chapter that you guys read for homework called "The Challenge of Reconstruction." Um, and there's a couple of really big issues, but this is sort of what I want to highlight here, and I'll also talk through a couple of other ones, which means that we went over all this in class, but you may have to be paying attention if you missed it otherwise. So, first thing is the effects of the Civil War geographically on both the North and the South. For the South, the war devastated their economy. Factories were destroyed, farmland was left empty, railroad lines were wiped out, cities were destroyed, no more investment money coming in, and the Confederate money was worthless by the end of the war. So, all of these things completely wiped out the South's economy. The South's agricultural abilities were also wiped out. The plantation system was completely undone. There were crops that were unharvested, and because much of the farmland was left empty, it would take years to recover what had been lost. And they no longer had workers for the farms because of the now free blacks who were all over the South. For the North really benefited from the war for the most part. The government was controlled by Northern Republicans, and during their time, they secured the Transcontinental Railroad Act, which ran the railroad across the country. Transcontinental means across the continent. The Transcontinental Railroad was established through lines that were favorable to Northern developers, and the government was going to pay for it. The Homestead Act, giving free land to people willing to move to the West, clear the land, and farm it for a certain number of years. They were then allowed to keep it, which encouraged settlement in the West, which expanded the United States size wise geographically. It also was an opportunity for the less fortunate, particularly for immigrants, very poor uh, urban dwellers, and for, quite frankly, the newly freed African American community to have a fresh start out in the West with free land. The moral tariff, which it's not a moral tariff as it's a good tariff, it's named after the guy who proposed it. The moral tariff raised the tax on goods coming into the country, making American products more appealing to people, which benefited American industry. The National Banking Act, which centralized the nation's money supply and eliminated a lot of the local money printing and a lot of the unsupervised distribution and use of like even regional money or like local credit. Easier immigration laws. It made it easier for people from parts of Europe that had previously not traveled here to get to America. And more importantly, it made it easier for them to become citizens and engage in productive participation in the economy legally. And last but not least, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a setup which was set up during the war actually to help with the question of the free blacks. Now, this leads us to sort of the next thing, which we talked about in class, which was really the Freedmen's Bureau is one of the really big sticking points that leads to the problems of Reconstruction. And this has a lot to do with the fact that even the abolitionists themselves could not really figure out what the heck to do with the blacks who are now free. So remember, an abolitionist is somebody who opposes slavery. And what makes this more complicated is there are three different groups of abolitionists. The first group are the people who believe that slavery is a moral evil and it violates God's law because all of us are made in the image and likeness of our Creator. And as a result, we are all equal and entitled to the same rights and benefits. Nobody should be a slave. The second group believes that slavery is bad, but that blacks and whites are never going to get along and they need to be separate. The third group are people who maybe think slavery is bad, maybe don't care. What they believe is that blacks don't belong in America and they need to go back to Africa. And the only way to get them all back to Africa is to officially abolish slavery. Once slavery was actually abolished, these three groups could no longer agree on how to approach taking care of the free blacks. Ironically enough, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, Those three divisions of the abolitionists eventually affect the African American community themselves. And you have three groups of civil rights activists who crop up. Those who believe that all of us are equal and gradually will all begin to accept that fact and eventually will have equality. Those who believe that even though we're all equal, nobody's ever going to accept that voluntarily, so you're going to have to force equality. It's sort of the exact same argument of we shouldn't be together because people can't accept each other. People can't accept each other, so you have to force us to be together now instead of being apart. And the last group are the blacks who believe that they don't belong here and they need to go back to Africa because that's just where they belong. It's a really weird sort of dichotomy. Now, this kind of goes into what we were talking about yesterday. So I'm going to flip up one slide and talk briefly about what we did yesterday and how this connects in with what we were reading. Okay. So if you remember from the reading, Andrew Johnson was nominated for the vice presidency largely because Republicans believed that because he had grown up as a poor white Southerner and he had, if there was one group of people that Johnson hated more than anybody, it was rich white Southerners. He felt that they were arrogant and they lorded themselves and they're being better than him over him, and he hated it. The Republicans thought that Johnson would be a natural ally for them. What they didn't realize is that his hatred for rich white Southerners did not extend to everybody in the South should be held accountable for the war. It was just the rich white Southerners should be. And it's not because of any other reason than he just wanted to humiliate them and show that he was better than them and, that they were nobody special. And unfortunately, probably most of the Republicans didn't realize that as much as Johnson, and Johnson truly hated rich white Southern plantation owners more than anybody, his disdain and hatred for blacks was close behind that. He really didn't prove to be too good of an ally on these things. Now, one of the things that your author points out is that under the 10% plan, which basically both Johnson and Lincoln supported, that was Lincoln's idea, all that you had to do was go in and you had to, 10% of the population had to approve had to take an oath of loyalty to the Constitution, and they had to approve the 13th Amendment. By the end of like 6 months, every state except Texas had done that. By the end of a little over a year, every state had done that. The problem was that in doing that, they assumed that they were going to have representation back in Congress, and they elected all the former Southern leaders back into government. They were also, when they wrote their new Constitution to officially abolish slavery, they were also placing limits on the citizenship rights of the now free blacks. And as a result of this, the Congress forced the passage of the 14th Amendment, which said that rights of citizens could not be restricted based on race or the former condition of their employment. Specifically, gun control in this country, the argument against the Second Amendment began with the effort to attempt to prevent blacks from owning firearms. It really was a race-based measure. Gun control began as a racist effort to prevent blacks from having guns. In order to prevent stuff like that, they had to define exactly what citizenship was. They also had to limit the ability of the state constitutions to restrict the rights of citizens. And this whole thing about throwing in that former Confederate politicians could not be elected was a direct result of the way that Southern states were approaching their readmission to the Union. This whole thing about repaying the war debt, that was just mean-spirited, by the way. And that's kind of like a Johnson thing, except that in Johnson's mind, it would be the rich people paying all the debts off, and it'd be the rich people suffering all the penalties, and it would be the rich who deserve to be punished. In Congress's mind, rich or poor, the South going to get punished. So that's where the 14th Amendment grows out of. It's this reaction to the way that the Southern states began their readmission process. And Johnson's support of that readmissions process is largely what began to earn him the animosity of Republicans. That and the fact that he went and outright vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau, which they then overrode, and that became the very first override ever in American history, when Congress overrode the veto of the president on the issue, or sorry, of the Civil Rights Act. Um, and because the Civil Rights Act was having such a hard time getting passed, they passed the 14th and 15th Amendment guaranteeing basic civil rights to people. Okay, that's just a wrap up on how the reading ties into the notes. And you have the notes up from yesterday. Hope this helps. Peace and love.